Testing, hello.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to WORJ, a town hall for the Counterculture. This is a special community history event hosted by the Orange County Regional History Center in conjunction with the relaunch of our new exhibit, new and continually new exhibit, Long Way to the Top, Hard Rock in Orlando, 1972 to 1985. I will try not to say anything about how young and youthful I am.
Yes.
This exhibit...
We were younger than you once.
I'm never going to get through this. This exhibit represents really the first 12 months in an ongoing collections and exhibits effort for us here at the History Center. This is the first exhibit that we've curated in-house in a couple of years, and it represents a new era for us here at the History Center and an opportunity to reflect on a really interesting time in Central Florida history. Before I get too far into this, I wanted to thank United Arts of Central Florida and the Florida Department of Cultural Resources, whose funding and support go into making amazing programs like this, and we hope that you guys will come out for many more. About a year ago, we were approached by a documentarian, a guy named Mark Padgett. Is Mark here tonight? Did Mark make it out? It's kind of a muggy night, maybe he didn't make it out. We were approached by a documentarian, a local guy who was involved with Jam Magazine and the Jammies back in the 80s, and he said, I'm making a documentary about BJ recording studios. And I am the research librarian here at the History Center. I work in our archive, so I look through to see what kind of resources we have about this so-called BJ recording studios. And we have practically nothing. It is a ghost in our archive. One of the things that will be built into this evening is a call for you who lived this history, who were a part of this history, who have things in your attics or under your bed or in your storage unit, to please consider sharing your story with us. On the other hand, this exhibit really represents the best of what we're about here at the History Center. Again, we normally go into our archive to field these kinds of exhibits, to see what kind of artifacts we have. We only had 3 items that you will see in the Long Way to the Top exhibit on the other side of the hall. Everything that you see was brought to us by a community member, some of the people here on the stage with us, some of the people here in the audience. If you're in the audience and donated or loaned something to the exhibit, please stand or raise your hand so people can see. This is a really wonderful thing. Bob Cara is here, and Jerry Duffy as well. We could not put on an exhibit like this or an event like this without your help. It's been a really wonderful thing. So we started looking into BJ recording studios. We started to find out about Judas Priest recording here, Molly Hatchet recording here, Pat Travers being here, on and on and on. And we were dropped sort of into the middle of things with this story about BJ. Immediately we start being pulled forward to talk about clubs like Spit, to talk about the new wave that was being played on stations like Zeta 7. But we were pulled further back into the past. I remember Hanna catching me when I went to visit her at East West Records, and she said, you have to go back and you have to talk about WORJ. You have to talk about FM 107 WORJ. And the story that we found has been a truly, truly amazing one. What you hear tonight and what you see in the exhibit is not the history of Central Florida radio. It's not even the history of WORJ, but it is a history of WORJ, and it is a story of this community that rocked out so hard and had so much fun and has aroused such incredible jealousy in the historians that are tasked with chronicling it. This is a really incredible thing, and what you will get tonight is history remembered by those who lived it. This is a really, really neat thing. I want to say, too, by the way of logistics, please refrain from using your Wi-Fi if you can. We're streaming this event tonight. We're also having it filmed as part of a documentary by Mark Herzig about the history of FM radio. It will be called It's Freeform Baby. Be sure to look for it. But I request that you stay off Wi-Fi if you can, so that we can get this streamed online. So I have a few questions that I want to start with in this story of WORJ. This is a story that starts out back in the 60s, all the way back in the 60s. And this is a story about experimental FM and the story of experimental FM becoming formalized, coming into its own, coming into a golden age of being more than a radio station, of these people who are sitting here before you being more than DJs. WORJ, from the best I can tell, becomes a way of life. in 1972, 1974, 1976, 77. It becomes so much more. The people that are choosing music for you are forging an authentic connection that is practically nowhere to be found in this day and age. This is a really special thing, and I want to go ahead and welcome, if I can, Hanna, Steve Mack, Lee Arnold, Neal Mirsky, Doug Van Allen, and Randy Molnar, the air staff from WORJ 1972. And if I can, let me sit here with you briefly, try not to fall off the stage here. I would like, if I may, to start with Doug Van Allen. WORJ becomes an FM station, 1968, 1969. The federal government deregulates FM. It becomes an experimental place for AM stations to rebroadcast, to double up on their broadcasting. What was Orlando like working in Orlando radio back in the early 70s prior to this formalization of WORJ?
Well, before I began my tenure at WORJ, I had worked at WLOF, which was Channel 95, baby. WLOF twin tone time. And WLOF, I worked there from 1968 through 71. I did midnight to 6 for the first year I was there while I kind of cut my teeth, and then was moved into afternoon drive, which is the air shift that I held until I left there in late 71 to do a brief stint at a AM station, a top 40 station in St. Louis. Well, that station changed format, and after being sacked, along with my best friend who had gotten me the job up there, I moved back to Orlando and started looking for an opportunity here, and was hired by a gentleman by the name of Steve Flesher, who at the time was the program director at WORJ. I had read back in the mid-60s in Broadcasting Magazine, when I was a music major in college, that the FCC had granted a license for an FM station in Mount Dora. I had no idea at the time that ultimately I would wind up being a part of this wonderful organization that would change my life, and indeed, which I like to think, change the Orlando community. So I came back and I was hired by Steve Flesher, but it was the early days of FM when things were very, very loosely knit, if you will. It was nice having the freedom of being able to play whatever you wanted to. We didn't have much of a format to give us structure, as I recall, but again, that was a long time ago. I started out doing 6 a.m. to noon, and the station really was nowhere near the potential that it had, because FM in those days was kind of like a throwaway. WKIS, which was a local AM station that played middle-of-the-road music and had a lot of talk, had an FM station. Their antenna was mounted on top of one of their 3 towers for their directional array. And they just, segued Mantovani records and played free doctor's office music, if you will, free music. Yeah, the so-called elevator music. And in their wisdom, they figured this FM thing's never really going to take off, so they sold the license. And that station became WDIZ.
All right. Yeah.
So, they kind of miscalculated there about the potential for FM. So I got into the FM scene, if you will, here in Orlando, just as it was really taking off. WORJ had a limited but very loyal and appreciative audience. And the ratings there were so low that the general manager at the time wanted a change that was going to attract bigger audience so they could charge more for commercials. That's how commercial radio worked, folks. And so they brought in Pat O'Day, who had been the program director at WLOF. He had recently been fired from WLOF. O'Day was well known for his on-air and off-air shenanigans. He could be difficult to work with sometimes. Yeah, honest. I swear. I was there at 2 stations with him. And so he got this idea that he was going to make WORJ a pop station. So we started morphing into something that was a little bit more like WLOF, but on the FM band where it could be in stereo. And he resurrected an old jingle package that he found in the archives and put jingles on the air and played bubblegum music. And I suffered through this for a few months. And then there was such a backlash from WORJ's fledgling audience that it was obvious. Yeah, no, there were more than 3. Trust me, the letter writing campaign was massive. And so it was obvious that that really wasn't the right move. And so the general manager, Jack Curran, with whom I had also worked at WLOF, brought Lee Arnold in from Cocoa Beach. I remember the day he came to me in the hallway and said, "I'm thinking about hiring this guy, Lee Arnold. Do you know him?" And I said, "Never heard of him." So Lee took over as program director and did something that program directors are not generally known for doing. Rather than coming in and brooming the place and firing everybody and bringing in his own staff of his cronies from other markets, he decided to wait and see who might have potential and should be kept and who needed to be shown the door. Well, long story short, I got kept. And so...
One of the best moves I've ever made.
Aww.
Yeah.
And Mike, well, I'll let Lee tell the story about Mike. But for me, I was there from the time that WORJ was really just kind of trying to find its footing through the misstep of having it be a pop music station to having somebody that had brilliant ideas and a sense of direction for the format come in and take control and make the station what it ultimately became. So that's the story of how
So what year was that?
I started. Yeah, the 70s were good to us, and I don't.
Somewhere back in the past.
Yeah, I started there in April of '72, and Lee started in August.
You raise a good point about WLOF. One of the things that we have found, working on this story is, there's so much crossing over, and Orlando seems to be such a different place, and at the same time, sort of the same place that it is even now. So there was so much crossover in this community, people moving from one medium to another, one format to another. And you mentioned WLOF. One of the names that loomed large when we started on the BJ section was, of course, Bill Vermillion, the weird beard. And his movement from WLOF into BJ Recording Studio really became one of the central movements as this story starts to expand. It's really kind of a pivotal moment for us. Something similar, actually, in Hanna's case. Hanna, you and Roman started East West Records in 1971. You guys came here and are currently running, this is a very important point, currently running the second oldest record store in the southeastern United States, second only to Ernest Tubb. It's a huge deal. It's a truly historic place, and I can't leave there without giving you some of my money. But you started there, and one of the things that led you to WORJ was your time there. What was it like coming in as a business owner to work with these guys, or what was it like running East West at the start?
I came in to cut a commercial for my shop, and this dude walked up to me and goes, "Ever thought about being a DJ?" And that was it. That was it. And my husband was like, "No, we're running a business. We've got 2 stores." So I went, and now we have an opportunity for me to become a DJ. So of course I'm going to take it. I'm going to jump on it. Now, that being said, all these gentlemen here are broadcasters. I am no broadcaster. I'm a business person, but first and foremost, I'm a music geek. All I wanted to do was find a quick and effective delivery system for music. There were no MP3s, there were no MP nothings, but I wanted to turn people on to what made my heart swell, what made me well up. And to this day, that's the only thing that's keeping me in this business. I still love doing that. I still love turning people on to music. Not old music, not new music, music, glorious, beautiful music. And it's still out there, and it's still being made by young people. So well, in my day, no. There's always been horrible music, and there's always been great music. This guy had faith in me. He put me on the air weekends, 2 a.m. to 8 a.m., out in the middle of nowhere in Winter Garden, in this little, like, bunker. And he says, okay, kid, go. That's how I started in this. So basically, he had faith in me. And the only other thing I can say is this man, Lee Arnold, never slept. I remember doing a terrible mix between one record and another record. And this guy, it's like 4:15 in the morning. This guy calls me. Hotline, we had a hotline. Calls me on the hotline, and of course I know it's either him or Mike Lyons. So it's Lee, and he goes, Hanna, that was terrible. And I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. He goes, you might have broken the record. And I thought, oh God. And I said, I'll do better. And he said, don't worry, no one's listening. It was the most liberating thing I had ever said. So this man helped to liberate my on-air persona. The other one was Lyons, Mike Lyons, who is not here, but who I talk to like he is here. Mike Lyons was the one who told me the secret to broadcasting. He said, you don't talk to an audience, you talk to one person. If it helps, you put a picture of that person in front of you, and you just chat with that person. And my God, after that, everything was easy. Between no one's listening and talk to one person. I had it made, and I had the best time in my life. And all these gentlemen who were, frankly, not really happy to have a girl in their all-boys club. They were so awesome after they warmed up, after a couple months, after a while. Lee Arnold, spectacular. He was the only boss I've ever had, because I've always been my own boss. But Lee Arnold was so supportive and so awesome and so visionary in what he wanted. We were allowed to be our own programmers. We were allowed to play what we wanted. I remember calling Lyons at 3 o'clock in the morning and saying, I'm going to play Patti Smith Horses now. Okay. And he'd go for it. So they were the ones. These two gentlemen, these incredible, brilliant, wonderful gentlemen were the ones that made it so special and helped us all grow up musically, I think. Okay, that's all I got.
Lee, when you were brought on in 1972, as Doug mentioned, there had been a letter writing campaign. FM 107 WORJ had been around for a few years, had been sort of a mix of a progressive style, a more adventurous style, and a top 40 format. And there sort of mixes back and forth. And the decision to shift, the popular decision to shift into a more progressive rock format, and not so much prog rock in the sense of King Crimson or Thick as a Brick or Yes, but really what ends up being cemented to me in those early years is this kind of progressive rock ideology. So I guess my question for you to start with, in the course of onboarding Randy and Steve and Neal, what did you see when you started at WORJ? What was the potential? What were the things you saw you needed to do I guess what were you trying to make of WORJ when you came on in '72?
First, turn off your phones.
What were you thinking when you hired me?
What was I thinking? Well, first, let me just say a couple things if I can. Before the 1972 WORJ that I inherited from Pat O'Day, and took it from being a top 40 radio station and returned it to its rightful place to being the most listened to progressive rock station in America. There were people that came before us, and WORJ came on the air in 1969, I believe, and as Doug said, I mean, Orlando wasn't easy. I mean, this is a pretty right-wing town, and this was the Orlando Sentinel was the last major newspaper in America to call for Richard Nixon's resignation. That was Orlando, okay? And they were owned by the Chicago Tribune, a fairly right-wing newspaper, who had called for his resignation 3 weeks before that. Richard Nixon got to come and play FTU, FTU, because it was the last place that he could go without getting booed. That was Orlando. So when those people put this radio station on in 1968, this was a tough crowd. So I tipped my hat to those guys because they planted seeds. Did they have a giant audience? They had no budgets. They had nothing, except guts. And a number of them have contacted me this week and wanted to give a shout out. And I just want to shout out to Brother Dave Carter, Greg Galloway, who would like to be here, but he's in Montana, Hugh Gary, and then Jim Kerr went on to become a very famous disc jockey in New York. And then other than our show that we did until I was escorted out of the building. When I was escorted out of the building, there were new people that came in, and some of my people were still there, and some of them got replaced, and blah, blah, blah. And so it lasted, till 1979, and then it became Zeta 7, under new ownership who didn't quite understand the concept that there was a branding that had happened for a number of years called WORJ. And that Zeta 7 thing, though a lot of people only remember that because that's their youth place. But the people who tried to maintain the WORJ up until 1979 and into its transition as Zeta, because after all it was the rock station, they deserve a shout out as well, because they worked their butts off to keep something really important going. And a number of them contacted me as well. Bill Mims, my dear friend Brock Whaley, who I wish was here tonight. I mean, he's not dead, I'm not saying that. Yeah. I wish he was here tonight. Brock, and Mike Cooper, who I do believe is here tonight. And those people worked really, really hard to keep it going. So they deserve a big darn shout out because they were all part of this thing that was WORJ. That being said,
Let's talk about that.
1972 to 1975, I view, and because I was there, as the golden age of this radio station. We were the #1 most listened to progressive rock station in America. When stations in Los Angeles, KMET, KSAN in San Francisco, and NEW in New York,
Yeah.
and MMR in Philadelphia, and these were big radio stations. They had 2 shares. That's not a big. It's a lot of people if you're in New York, but it's still 2% of the listening audience. We're a 7-share radio station. There was nothing like us anywhere. It was a great radio station, and it was because of these people. But my entire original air staff is on the stage, okay, from 1972. You know, I hired, well, I kept Tim, I kept Doug, which is one of the greatest moves I've ever made. He's been my lifelong friend since then. When he was at LOF, he had 45 shares an afternoon drive. I mean, I would have been crazy to get rid of it. You know, he was also, as I like to say, near perfect. And I won't tell you the reason he wasn't perfect.
I will.
When it gets back to him, he'll tell you how he became. Yeah, we went from an A+ to an A. And the next person that I hired was Mike Lyons down at the end. He was already there doing a thing called Flash News, but it was an unpaid position. Michael was young. He was barely out of Edgewater High School at that time. I got to act, there's a Edgewater scholarship for Mike that's given out every year. And this year I got to actually present that to this young man at Edgewater. And when I did it, I told them, I talked about Mike. I said, you know, I don't know if you realize who this scholarship is about, but I want to tell you about Mike Lyons. And so I got to do that. And as I left the stage, one of the administrators went, I didn't know why this award was called the Mike. Thank you so much for telling us about Mike Lyons. You know, so that made me feel really good. And that's Mike down there. Mike passed away a while ago from the Big C. And but he's in this room. Yesterday was Mike Lyons' birthday. Michael is floating around in this room tonight. Okay. And then our dear friend Rob Word, also from Focus on Films. Rob called me this week too and said, I wish I could come in from California, but I've got this Roy Rogers convention or some such thing. And but please send my love to everybody also. So what was your question? I'm sorry.
Well, actually, it may be a question for Neal, for Neal and Steve, and for Randy to be thinking about as well. I'll point. If you had a chance to go through the exhibit already, one of the items that you'll see is a commencement program from FTU that Lee mentioned that Richard Nixon came through, and as it turns out, there was an article about WORJ in the issue of the Sentinel Star the day that Nixon quit. So there was the headline "Nixon quits," and then further back in the paper there was an article about WORJ, and it seemed to be fitting in some strange way. But one of the things that Neal mentioned recently was that this was a different world in so many ways. Gas was 39 cents a gallon, but it wouldn't be for long. And Nixon was in office and wouldn't be for long. And, this was the station that spoke to an entire community of people who were experiencing these changes in Orlando. What did it mean to you guys to be progressive rock? And maybe this is a question for everybody to sort of start opening this up. But,
and then I'll give it to Neal. Interestingly, tomorrow was my first day at WORJ. So yesterday was Mike Lyons' birthday. Today is Maury Eisenman's birthday, who was Together Productions and allowed us to do our first live broadcast of POCO from the Orlando Sports Stadium. And then tomorrow was my first day at WORJ. So I mean, it's like this confluence of
and it's National Radio Day.
And today is National Radio Day. So we just wanted to be the greatest radio station that we could be. I mean, that was our plan. We didn't have staff meetings, we had encounter sessions. We did them weekly. We did them in my office. We cried, we laughed, we did crazy stuff. But we all shared the same vision of where we wanted to go to with the radio station. I mean, vision is an interesting thing. If you can get everybody to share your vision, they can screw up moving forward. You know, it's never a mistake. You know, so we shared a common vision of where we wanted to go, and we wanted to be the best radio. We didn't want to be the best progressive rock radio station in America. We wanted to be the best radio station in America. We wanted to do things that nobody had done before. We wanted to explore areas that were unexplorable. We wanted to broadcast artists live, on a consistent basis. But we were in Orlando, you know, but we pulled that off. We did things that no one thought we could do, and we did it without a budget.
Absolutely no budget.
No budget at all. And ended up giving away, you know, did amazing contests, and we were tight, and there was none of that FM pregnant pause crap at the end of a song. You know, the song would end, and then you count 1, 2, 3, and some hippy-dippy guy would come on and go, oh, here on FM Spaghetti Land. You know, we did professional radio, but played great music. And our attitude about what was great music was it great? You know, did we play Emmylou Harris and Miles Davis and Led Zeppelin and Crosby, Stills and Nash and the Dillards and, you know, and if it was great, we played it, and people couldn't understand how we could possibly get away with it. And that was because that was the genius of these people on this stage, because they understood how to play the music so that you never got so far out that you lost the audience. I always thought of it as a listener, you're always only one song away from the song you absolutely love. And in the process, you may discover you love this thing that you never thought you could possibly love. You know? And so we were an entertainment educational thing, you know? But you had to entertain them, but you had to educate them too. And people who come up, I've had people for 40 years tell me, ORJ was the station that taught me about music. You know, you taught me about how big it could be. Doug would play classical stuff on the air. You know, we did stuff. The only criteria was, is this great? Okay, play it. So I'm gonna give it to Neal.
First off, I don't know what you were thinking when you hired me from that audition tape I sent you. ORJ was my second job in radio, not counting, I'd been in the Navy for 4 years and had done Armed Forces radio, and then I got out and I landed my first job in West Palm Beach. And then after a year, I sent this tape to Lee Arnold at ORJ, and I don't know why, but he hired me, and I moved to Orlando, and I was there, I think I started in February 73. I was there 73, 74. And I mean, it would be easy to say that ORJ was a great radio station because we had an incredible program director, an amazing air staff. We had brilliant promotions, a great support staff, and this would all be true. But I think the biggest thing that we had going for us, on top of all of those things, it was just the era of the greatest music. And it was music that, I mean, just for example, in 73 and 74, the first Leonard Skinner album, McCartney's Band on the Run, Elton John, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, Stevie Wonder's Inner Visions, The Who's Quadrophenia, Zeppelin's Houses of the Holy, Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon, Joni Mitchell's Court and Spark, Genesis, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. I mean, I can't think of 3 songs from the last 5 years that are going to be around 5 or 10 years from now, the way this stuff still is. So we had the advantage of having this amazing music to play, and it was really the only place that you could hear all of this music. No, where else are you going to hear it? On the top 40 AM station? But the other thing was the freedom. I mean, I would go on the air from 6 to 10 in the morning, and basically I had 2 turntables, a wall of albums, and 4 hours to fill. And basically we painted with music, with segues, concept sets, themes. We had the freedom, thanks to this guy, we had the freedom to really just paint with music. And I had been inspired. I grew up just outside of New York City and grew up with WNEW-FM, and there was a guy who did mornings there called Pete Fornatel. And I got into radio, I wanted to be Pete Fornatel. This guy had turned me on to such great music, and Lee gave me the opportunity to do just that.
Steve.
just trying to figure out how you remember all those dates.
Yeah, but I couldn't say what I had for lunch today.
Yeah, we used to talk about drugs on the air. Now it's Celebrex, that sort of thing. But speak for yourself. No. We had a great time. There's no two ways about it. It was a circus, but it was a fun circus. Lee and I go back to the beach, Cocoa Beach, Melbourne. We were at WTAI together, which stood for Where the Action Is. Some action. It played country in the morning, played progressive in the afternoon. There was a clash, if I ever saw one. I was hired to that station from a country radio station, and one of the choices I had to make was, should it go country or should it go progressive? Here's a question from me. Progressive, of course, was the only way to get. That's where my head was to begin with, and it made total sense to me. Country was country, but progressive was a new thing. A new thing in that there was all this new music coming out, and I thought Lee really knew what he was doing. Just the sheer flow of it just got to me. After a while, we began to team up a bit, teamed up a lot, and had a lot of fun with it. Some of it I remember. Most of it I don't. But we gave it a college try. We were a small station, and as in those days, it just could not make it happen. We wound up doing top 40 radio for a while. That was the hippest top 40 you ever heard.
Not there.
No. It was a WKKO. And Ted and Lillian Island were the owners of that station, and they pretty well let people have their heads. They were great folks. And we were there for a while, and then Lee was called to duty in Orlando. And after a bit, I got a call from Lee. And I remember making those night drives for quite a while. It was driving me insane. Mike said, well, I got another room in here. Why don't you just move in for a while until we get... And I said, okay, fine. And I did. So I owe Mike for that, for sure. And got started up with that. The thing that was the beauty of WORJ was, as Neal said, as Doug said, as Lee said, as Hanna said, is the magic. And it was just an amazing magic because we had freedom. We could do things that we knew needed to be done and nobody had allowed us to do before. Lee made that happen. One of the things that was big for us was mixing music and not putting down clients. Too many radio stations said things like, we'll be back right after this. We didn't do that because clients made it happen. So they should be treated like people that are part of our group. They're making this happen for you, making it happen for us, making it happen for everybody, and making things take off for the future, which is just part of what we had in mind. It just blew us away every time we were written up in the trades that some other great thing that we have done. We said, nobody's done that before? What happened? But we took off with it, and we had a ball. And we kept getting accolades, and we kept thinking, that we got to share this with people, and the only way to do that is to just keep getting better and better. And we did that. But it was just a total gas. That's really about all I have to say, except I have enjoyed tremendously working with such a professional group of people. Kissy, kissy. But Lee and I, like I said, we went back a long way. I mean, we shared food, we shared housing, we shared all kinds of things, except the ladies.
You took me on to baked potatoes.
Baked potatoes, yeah.
I hated baked potatoes until Steve made them.
The things we remember. We had a blast. We were truly a family, and still are. It's like meeting these guys today. It was like meeting our brothers. I haven't seen some of these guys.
And sisters.
And sisters. haven't seen some of these guys in almost 40 years. By the way, Hannah, what was that comment you made out there about you were just a lady in the back with a tambourine?
That's what I felt like. I felt like I was
No.
the chick behind the band with the tambourine.
If she had a tambourine, baby, she was up front with it. She was a definite important part of this radio station. Having a female on the staff made us all proud, and she was no slouch. When she got in there, she did the job, and she did it excellently. Doug was a guy that I saw as a true professional, and a guy that we all learned a lot from. He got to it. He liked things done in 1, 2, 3 order, and that made that happen too. So I think it was really good all the way around. I enjoyed it. It was fun.
It was the best.
You guys want to do it again?
I want to add a couple things. When I hired Hanna, it was not because she was one of the most beautiful women that I had ever seen in my entire life, but that didn't hurt, okay? But I hired her because she had an unbelievable knowledge of music. She was totally fearless behind the microphone, and I knew she had the ability to communicate with an audience like how you would dream that she was a natural. And the fact she was a woman was in 4th place. I mean, I obviously could see that she was a woman, but it had nothing to do with the reason that I wanted Hanna on my radio station. And Steve said, you know, the advertisers. We went to our advertisers at WORJ and we said, your approach to our audience is not going to work. We have an enormous amount of the people you want to come into your store. We own men 18 to 34. We own men 18 to 49. We had triple the 18 to 34-year-old men of the next closest radio station in town. We were a station that could deliver people to our advertisers. So people like Jackie Sanderson, who's in the audience, she was like the greatest radio time salesperson in the history of mankind. Okay, Jackie would go out there and she would arm wrestle our advertisers into letting us take their bad commercials and turn them into commercials that fit the format of our radio station. And in the process of doing that, it made the radio station sound great, made it sound better. It fit. It was like Ralph Kazarian, where our WORJ billboard, the famous ORJ billboard, was on top of his building at the corner of 1792 and Colonial. And Ralph had the worst commercials in the world. But Ralph changed the commercials for our radio station, and then it worked for him. So, you know, it was about getting everybody to play the game with us. It was about getting everybody to understand that there was something going on here, and this audience was different. I also want to quickly say, over here is Bill Vermillion's son. Bill, Bill Vermillion, who was at WLOF and was the music director at a time that at Top 40 Radio, not many music directors had the ability to play the music that they decided to play. They usually had to answer to the program director who blah, 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 and thought he was in charge. But in fact, at WLOF, Bill was in charge of all the music that was played there. And WLOF, previous to me coming to ORJ, WLOF was the most progressive top 40 radio station in America in terms of their playlist. You know, they'd play if they were playing 40 new songs, you know, 5 or 6 may have been those bubblegum songs, and 6 of them may have been, Jackson 5-y kind of songs or whatever, you know, and, but the rest of them, their number 1 song was I Feel Free by Cream. The number 2 song was The Wind Cried Mary by Jimi Hendrix. Their number 3 song was The Vanilla Fudge, You Keep Me Hanging On. Okay, so Bill Vermillion made it easier for me to come in and make a radio station that said, hey, you know all those songs that I wouldn't say this, but we did kinda. You know all those songs that you like on WLOF? that band has 12 more just like that. Okay? And so it greased the way. It was the absolute brilliance, though, of Bill Vermillion, who understood, why don't we play good music on this top 40 radio station instead of the same crap that every top 40 radio station in America plays. And I was honored to then work years later with Bill when he helped build our radio station, when we bought our new facility, or when we moved into our new facility, and the stuff that we did at BJ Recording Studios together when he had left WLF. He was always a friend of WORJ. So Bill Vermillion, gets a big shout out to. I want to real quickly, and then I'm going to pass the mic. There's some guys who we worked with at WORJ who, other than Michael, who was so important to us, he was my dear friend, and we worked many times together over the years after ORJ. But there was also a guy named Paul Yeskel. Paul, we had a copywriter. She was lovely. She was a sweet woman. But she would, we'd get a commercial, and it would say Leonard Skinner and the band, and his band, Pink Floyd and his band. I mean, what was the other? Jethro Tull and his band. I mean, she wasn't part of our radio station. I can remember going to Jack Curran, our wonderful general manager, and saying, "We have to replace her, And he was like, "Yeah, go do it." And that's when we brought in a young man from New Jersey named Paul Yeskel. And Paul was started out as our copywriter, became our promotion director, and then was instrumental in helping book the talent for the Southern Progressive Radio Network. And Paul passed away a couple of years ago, too, and he was a killer. Then there was also Tom Webb. He was our news director. He was unbelievable. He was breaking stories. Tom Webb broke story. There was a guy named Jack Anderson, and if you're old enough, you know Jack Anderson. He was the most important syndicated investigative reporter in America. And Tom would feed stories to Jack Anderson, and then Jack Anderson would give us the exclusive back. He also he did a great thing called TW3. This was the week that was with Tom Webb, right? And covered things like Led Zeppelin breaking up. I mean, he was great. He went on to be the program director and news director of WMAQ in Chicago, and he passed away. Bobby Church. What can you say about Bobby? He was just a great fuck guy. Excuse me. Rick Namey, also, who was an integral part of the radio station and contributed a lot. And at one time was my partner when I was vice president of programming, and he was vice president of sales after Jack Curran, who was the most important person on this list, passed away. And Jack, to you, my friend. And Paul Weiss, who was just a short period of time, but he was a friend of ours from Cocoa Beach, who was also did White Indigo Lights, all those concerts out at the Orlando Sports Stadium. Paul was the guy who did all the lights and with the crazy shows and the stuff. And then Paul came on as our promotion director for a short period of time at the end, and Paul is also gone. And Emil Corona, who was the head of the whole company, and he's gone too. So those, they all deserve a shout out because they were all an integral part of what made WORJ the very, very special place that it was. And so far, the only person who hasn't said anything, gotten to say anything, is our buddy down at the end. And I've known him for, ever. We go back to Cocoa Beach together as well. And so I'm going to give you to Randy Molnar.
Thank you. Since I was a little kid, I wanted to be an actor, and that didn't seem like that was ever going to happen in Florida, so I decided I would go into radio. And one time I was came from a very musical family. Matter of fact, my sister Becky is here, and brother-in-law Michael. They're professional musicians, as well as Ron Sansone, and he was in our band in high school. And that influence with music was very broad, the type of music, and I really didn't care for the Dick Clark you know, if you can dance to it, give it a 10 type of a concept with music. And I was hearing things that were really different, but I had to seek it out on my own. And when I heard a station called TAI, which was Lee Arnold and several other people, as well as Steve Mack, I was stunned that somebody was actually playing this stuff on the air. And so I worked my way out there. I talked to Lee and he said, come out, but I went out there and he was not there, and Steve was, and he said, you can pull records for me. And I pulled records, and he explained to me how I could get a radio telephone broadcaster's permit, third-class radio telephone operator's permit with broadcast endorsement, and I went and got a job at a top 40 station where there were what, I think it was, I don't know, it was Lee Doug that came up with the term pukers. We'll go there now. And they said that it was really terrible. And don't do that, we're not going to be doing that. And so I listened to TI, and they were doing that. It was just regular people talking. I thought, well, that's cool. And the music was unbelievable, and I was shocked to constantly learn from the music and be impressed by the music on a regular basis. And years later, I ended up with that Paul Weiss, who really toured with some major acts. He did the globs of lights and blobs and stuff like that behind Hendrix and the Doors and Joplin and more, and with white indigo lights. And I learned lights from Paul. And I got a job with him working, we competed with each other with bands growing up, and doing the lights for them. And later on, he hired me to do lights in a nightclub. And that nightclub closed down, and we started to bring in rock and roll. And Lee joined us at that time at the nightclub, and we brought in he brought in amazing acts like a band nobody ever heard of called the Almond Joy.
Well, they were already the Allman Brothers by then.
And then they showed up and they were the Almond Brothers. It was confusing, and they were amazing. And Captain Beefheart and Ry Cooder and, oh gee, I just can't remember all the acts. Cowboy, yeah. Incredible things in a small nightclub. And after these sessions and shows, I would then go with Lee over to Steve Mack's place or to Lee's house, and for years we would talk about what if, because it was not being done in Orlando yet, or anywhere, you put rock and roll in stereo on FM. Well, that's a stupid idea, because only your parents have FM, and it's 101 strings and living strings, and Ronnie Aldrich and his 2 pianos and things like that, and living strings, and Peter Nero, and they're very conservative stations, ownerships, and like they would never go with it. But Lee had the kahunas to go to go talk with them and say, what if we brought you great numbers, because it's all about money? And they said, well, if we're not number one, we'll do it. And so we got real serious about coming up with a format. And they ended up being number 3, and then they reneged on everything they were going to do, and they didn't do it, and everything we'd been working on for years fell apart. So we went our own ways, and strangely, a couple of years later, and I didn't know that was tomorrow, but the day that Lee Arnold walked into WORJ down Orange Avenue and made a left into number 1 North Orange, a building, was the same day that I came down Central and turned right and walked into the building at the exact same time and went up the elevator at the same time, he not knowing that I had been hired on the AM station. 3 months later, I was a program director of the AM, and Lee was a program director of the FM. Yeah, we were doing music from the big band era. And so...
the coolest big band radio.
Yeah. Yeah, and I actually utilized the programming concepts that we had talked about. 15 minutes of music. In other words, we created format that was appealing to the audience. In that format, there are slots that the sales department could sell. And then those commercials became a part of it. And like Jackie Sanderson, would convince advertisers, very hardcore advertisers, let us have commercials our way to reach our people, and it worked, and it made money. But I think the thing about it was that astounded me with the whole concept of ORJ that was different than anything was that Lee hired musicologists. He knew everybody knew music, and we learned about music, and we studied music. And he also made arrangements along with Mike Lyons that every one of us received every new album that came into the station for it to be considered for a play, that we also received and had word about it. And then Mike would put with his color pen what songs he thought and highly suggested he would play, and then each of us had a different colored pen. And Steve's was red. I remember that. And we would each mark what we liked, and so we could see what the other guys were playing. And it was an educational process, and it was also a lifestyle, and it was the sociology of that time period that we believed in, and it was reflected in the music and the words of the music. And so we were really very, very, very much like a family. So it wasn't a flighty thing with jocks in and out, because we wanted to stay with what we were doing and what we believed in. But then Lee and the guys grew it into an experience where we were involved with the music, with the promoters, with the concerts, with the musicians, and we had musicians that sought us out. And I think it was really odd that years later, and I know you had told me stories that you would find out that stations that we greatly admired, like KSAN and others in Atlanta and New York and Chicago and stuff, different announcers would pass because of Disney World being built, would pass through Florida, and they would see what we were doing. We didn't realize that we were influencing people, but they would then go back to their markets and create very highly successful radio stations based on this model of what we had done. So it was a time that was very innovative. Being involved with the music and all the musicians that would come in, that was astounding. Different people that would stop by. I remember one night, it seems like it was your show, but I remember tuning into your show, and all of a sudden you had Country Joe McDonald, because
with his pig-nosed amplifier.
Yeah, you went and picked him up. I don't know how you knew he was in Daytona Beach. You picked him up and brought him there and said, all of a sudden he was just playing live in the studio, and that became the norm for doing things, and that developed into the Southern Progressive Radio Network that you might want to say something about.
You just reminded me of something, because Rick Namey and I drove to Daytona we picked Country Joe up, and as we were getting off the off-ramp from I-4, he was in Daytona. We picked him up in Daytona. We were in, I think it was Rick's car. It was some big Detroit gas guzzler. And just as we're coming on the off-ramp of I-4 at Colonial, the car just stops running, and we're stuck in the middle of this off-ramp. And Rick and I and this woman who was in his band, one of the musicians in his band, we all got out and to push the car down the ramp to 50, and Country Joe McDonald just sat in the middle of the back seat like this. I love his music, but I will never forget that. When Steve mentioned, just to give you an example of how passionate we all were about the music, Steve had briefly mentioned a little bit ago that there was a period where he and Mike Lyons were roommates in an apartment across from Rollins College in Winter Park. And there was kind of a thing going on. Remember, we had one of our weekly staff meetings, and Steve refused to play ZZ Top's LaGrange on principle, because you felt that it was just a ripoff, these old blues artists or something, and even though, and Mike Lyons, the music director, kept saying, you need to play this, and Steve says, no, I won't, it's a ripoff. And it got so escalated in the meeting to where they were screaming at each other, and I remember Mike says, Steve, why aren't you playing ZZ Top? And Steve shouted back, why don't you take out the garbage?
True story.
Lee, I'll ask you actually, everybody, and as I ask questions, I'll start passing the mics back and forth so we can have one for you three and one for you three. Randy, you mentioned the strangeness at that time of FM and stereo, and that like as you mentioned earlier today, unless you had a 1960 Mercedes, you weren't listening to that kind of music. And you guys have mentioned as well the relationship that you guys have with your advertisers and with your audience. This is a very organic thing, that you're talking to people who are sort of in the business of sort of living their lives, and this is music is a part of that. Living their lives is a part of that as well. But you guys pushed music, but you also pushed FM stereo in particular. And so I wanted to ask you guys to speak. The last two I'll ask, and then I'll open this up, and I know a lot of you guys have stories to tell as well, and I'll open this up for questions and answers. But the Holler Chevrolet FM installation is a story I would really like to hear, and then and then of course the story. One of the stories that's central to our exhibit is this relationship with BJ Studios that is the Southern Progressive Radio Network. So those are sort of two that I'd love to hear you guys speak to.
Well, as Jackie Sanderson knows, we invented how to do promotions without money, because we had no budgets for that kind of stuff, and I always called our sales force and and even our traffic person Toy. I would go to her and I go, "You do progressive traffic." The woman who scheduled the commercials and how they ran, we had them run in a particular way so that they sounded right. It was like doing music mixes with commercials. And it was because Toy understood what we were trying to do. We were a team from top to bottom. This was not programming versus sales. This was, we're on this team, and how can we win together? And everybody got it. Jackie was the leader of the sales force on that. She showed the others how you could do that. And so we had the progressive sales force. Oh, and that's the.
and I almost got arrested by the big fat policeman.
Oh, I have a great picture of that in the thing.
And then Jack said, "Well, why didn't you let him arrest you? We would have gotten news coverage."
and he was right. The only cars that had FM at that time were Japanese cars, interestingly enough.
10% FM penetration of American automobiles in 1993.
And the only companies that were putting FMs automatically in their cars were companies like Datsun and Honda and people like that, because actually in Japan they actually cared about that. And it wasn't until a couple of years later, after we started doing this, that it actually became a law in the United States that cars had to have FM as well as AM when they put a car radio in the car. But so we were at a disadvantage because obviously, luckily in the days of WORJ, and that's why I did the evening shift, because it was the right shift if you wanted to reach your if you wanted to have the biggest audience, you did the evening shift in those days, because people, and they weren't in their cars, right, where they couldn't hear you, okay? And in those were the days when radios, when people at home who are 18 to 34, 18 to 49-year-olds watch television with the sound down and WORJ on, okay? Television was simply magic pictures running to distract them while they listened to the best music in the world. So what could we do to get FMs into cars? Well, we could sell new cars to people. That's not easy. So they came out with these FM converters. They cost, what were they, like $29 or $19, $19.99. And that was our wholesale price for them. And so we bought thousands of these at $19.99. We went to Holler Chevrolet there on Fairbanks, which was like the dealer in town. Holler Chevrolet was the deal. And our pitch to Holler was, we have all these men who buy cars. They could buy Corvettes, but they'll certainly buy Impalas and stuff. And you'd like to get our audience into your place. How could we do this? What would be a really cool way of doing this? Why don't you do this thing with us where we sell these FM converters at cost, okay? Nobody makes money on it, okay? You don't make money on it, we don't make money on it, and you guys install them for free, okay? But while it takes that 10 or 15 minutes to install it, you are selling cars to these people, you know? And Holler was like, yeah, okay. So we backed traffic down Fairbanks all the way to 1792, okay? And the police would come out, and that's the picture Jackie was talking about, with all of us, and the cops the Winter Park police on their motorcycles, all who were really friendly and sweet to us, because we always tried to be really friendly and sweet to them. And, you know, we would bring them drinks and stuff. Hey, I know you guys are out here, you know, doing the traffic. Thank you so much. And we put thousands of FM converters into cars. We didn't wait for people to go buy them at their discount place. We brought them to them at cost because it was to our advantage for them to have FM in their car. So that was, you know, that was.
And while they were installing the FM converters in the cars, the disc jockeys who were broadcasting live from Holler were bolting these things onto the front of your car.
We, over the course of 3 years, and these are metal, and they were, because I would not do plastic ones. I don't have one. Okay, and you take this one, maybe. These were metal, and because I wouldn't do plastic, because plastic was crap, and they cracked. And as you can see, these still exist. And we did almost 100,000 of those, and we never sold anything. We never sold a T-shirt. We never sold a bumper sticker. We never sold a license plate. We gave them away because they're billboards. And the day that I knew that we had won was the day when I picked up the Orlando Sentinel, and on the cover there had been a heavy rainstorm the day before, and on the very cover, above the fold, quotation marks, was a picture of a Volkswagen van, you know, camper, coming through a puddle, but the focus was not exactly on the van. The focus was on the license plate on the very front, and it was the WORJ license plate on the front page of the Orlando Sentinel, who didn't like us that much. Okay. And I saw it that day, and I said to myself, oh, okay, you know what? We're the #1 station in town. There's not a doubt in my mind now. And in fact, we were. Real quick, shout out to my wife and kids. Gay, I know you're in Milwaukee. I love you. And my daughter and my sons, I love you. Had to do that, or I couldn't go home to Milwaukee on Sunday. What was the question? Real quick, and just before I give it back to Adam, I just want to say, Adam, who is that guy down there, is the guy who puts on these unbelievable exhibitions, and and his person, Emily, who's like in charge of actually making them happen.
She's back by the door.
Okay, and she's back there by the door. Are two of the most amazing people I've ever worked with in my entire life, and I just want to give them a little shout out because they're
On behalf of Emily, I will thank you for both of us. But the next question, and like I said, is really sort of one of the centerpieces, the tent poles of Long Way to the Top, and really starts to set the stage for the kind of attitude that you see coming out of BJ Studios. I mean, you guys are formalizing progressive rock or the FM format at a time when the Outlaws are starting to come out of Tampa. Leonard Skinner is coming out of Jacksonville. 38 Special is coming out of Jacksonville. Molly Hatchet ends up coming out of Jacksonville. Blackfoot. There ends up being this pipeline, and at the start of it is WORJ and BJ Recording Studios. you guys put together the Southern Progressive Radio Network and started broadcasting live shows, which for me, one of my favorite parts of researching this whole exhibit, researching for this event, was receiving a set of discs from Doug that Doug and Bill had worked on. These discs had to go through the reels that were originally recorded for the Southern Progressive Radio Network. You guys did an amazing restoration job. These things sound like they could be released today. Hour-long, uninterrupted concerts. Emmylou Harris, while she's promoting Pieces of the Sky, 1972. Randy Newman is in the pre-short people phase, which for me was a whole new world for a whippersnapper my age. The Atlanta Rhythm section, Kathy McDonald, these shows, and the idea that I could put on an hour-long show, I started listening to them for research, and Emily was requesting, listen for references to Orlando, listen for things relative to Central Florida, and I put it on, and the first thing I hear is Neal saying, this is what we are now calling the Southern Progressive Radio Network. Here's Emmylou Harris with a genuine country band. And then you get exactly that. You get Emmylou Harris and a genuine country band for 1 hour without fail. And so I wanted to ask you guys, what was it like putting on these shows? What was it like meeting every so often with some of the hottest artists really across genres? Gary Wright, all these, the diversity was really impressive, and the commitment to music was really great. So if you guys could talk about the Southern Progressive shows.
Let me quickly do that, and then I'll pass it on. I always wanted to do live music on the radio. I thought that was a real hook for us, because that's who we were, right? And 3 months after I became the program director of the radio station was the first time we did a live broadcast, and that was Maury Eisenman. Again, shout out, because he allowed us to broadcast Poco live from the Orlando Sports Stadium. That was the first time anybody had ever done that here, And then we did broadcasts from the back door of people like Brian Auger, and we had people like Country Joe and Bob Seger come out to the radio station and play. But we wanted to take it bigger than that. And so I went to the record companies. I was the program director, so it was my job to hit the record companies and say, I'd like this band or this band to come in. We have this arrangement at BJ Recording Studios. I talked to Bill, and then I, of course, talked to Eric Schaubacher, who owned the place, and said, hey, you want to do this? And they were like, yeah, And so I went to record companies, and I said, I'd like your band to come in. I want you to pay for it, of course, because we have no budget for anything. And but we'll broadcast them live to all of our audience. And they came back to me and they went, not enough people. You were in Orlando, it's market 70 at that time. It wasn't big enough for them. And so I walked away from that and I said, okay, so what do I do about that? We'll start a network. And that's when we started the Florida Progressive Radio Network. I went to the folks at WPDQ in Jacksonville, said, you want to be a part of this? And they were, yeah. I went to GVL in Gainesville, you want to be part of this? Yeah. QSR in Tampa, you want to be part? Now I went back to the record companies, and I said, how about Tampa, Jacksonville, Orlando, Gainesville? Oh, I think we're going to add Miami to it now, too. And they were like, yeah, when do you want our artist? We would love to bring them in. And and we played a fairly eclectic mix of music. So it was part of what what started out as the Florida Progressive Radio Network, and then we added some stations outside of Florida, and it became the Southern Progressive Radio Network. But I mean, our artists were Kathy McDonald, and this was all in the course of a year, so it was just about once a month. Kathy McDonald, Howdy Moon. Who was the lead singer of Howdy Moon? And who was she related to? Was nobody. Valerie Carter, but she was wonderful. Hudson Ford, and they had a little background in another band called the Straubs, and Tim Weisberg. And then we did Randy Newman, and you may know Randy Newman from Small People and from doing Disney stuff. Some of you younger people.
Show ever. I've got to stop you right now. The best show ever. The Randy Newman show was hilarious.
Randy Newman at that time was the hippest, coolest artist in the world. Okay, he wrote great music. He was heavily political. And another radio station that was doing live broadcasts in America was WLIR on Long Island. And it was very easy for them to do live broadcasts. They started after us, but they had their pick of artists because they were on Long Island. They come in from New York. But the one artist they could never get was Randy Newman. He would never do it for LIR. And when we got Randy Newman, they were so jealous it made my day. I mean, they were so jealous. They were like calling me constantly, could we get a copy of that? Blah, blah, blah. You know, I mean, it was so much fun to beat them on that one. We did Leo Kottke, and then we added WQDR in Raleigh, and we became the Southern Progressive Radio Network. We added WRAS in Atlanta, because there wasn't a commercial rock station in Atlanta at that time. We added the southernmost member of our Southern Progressive Radio Network, 2JJ in Sydney, Australia. And we added a fledgling college radio station, I believe started by Mike Cooper, wherever he is here in the room, WFSU in Tallahassee. And so we became the Southern Progressive Radio Network, and we kicked that off with Emmylou Harris, which was just one of the, those are the days where it was progressive country, you know, but it didn't separate it from what we were doing. I mean, to be a progressive rock station was not to be the station that played Yes and the Moody Blues. It was the station that played everything that was great. Then we did Lonnie Liston Smith. That's how far we would go up. And we shared that one with our progressive black station, WORL, who was no longer a big band station, but was the hippest black station in America. Okay. And then we did Atlanta Rhythm Section, and then we did Gary Wright, and then the last one was the Michael Stanley Band. So that was our thing. So you can see, I mean, the gamut of the kind of artists that we were doing was just so amazingly diverse, and the quality of these broadcasts are just absolutely amazing. You know, so that was, you know, that. that was that.
Can you kind of cover something else, because it had to do with music, relationship between the radio station and live music, and we had so many famous musicians that would just come by the station that we know or we would communicate with or became aware of us. But the institution of, or the development of Southern rock, and we worked with, you know, Charlie Daniels and Marshall Tucker Band and the Outlaws and on. But would you go into a little bit about, Lee, about what was that relationship that we developed with the Outlaws and how that became a New Year's Eve event?
Oh, that was really kind of cool. You know, Charlie Bresco, who was their manager, and Charlie was a good guy. I mean, we were really good friends with all the Southern bands. I mean, the guys in Skinner were friends of ours. Okay, the guys in the Allman Brothers, hell, I mean, we go back to Cocoa Beach together. They were I had a rock hall in Cocoa Beach or in Merritt Island called the Image North. They came to me one day after their second album had come out, Idlewild South. They weren't stars, except in Florida, off of their first two albums. Until the Fillmore album, they didn't really break. And they came to me one day at my Image North place, and they said, "Hey, could we be the opening act for all of your shows?" You know, and I was like, well, what do you need to do that? And they said, we want to be a arena band. We want to be a band that can play large venues, because my place held 5,000. And they said, so if we could set up here and just practice here during the day, we'll play for free and be the opening act on all your shows, which they did for about a year. And then one day they came to me and they said, I don't know how to tell you this, Lee, but we were offered this other gig, and we're really conflicted about it, and we don't want to leave you because you've been so good to us. And I said, well, what's the other gig? And they said, well, Bill Graham offered us to be the house band at the Fillmore East. And I was like, well, you know, I think you should do that. Soon thereafter, they recorded the album live at the Fillmore East, and they became the Allman Brothers Band. you know, and the Cowboy, which, you know, Tommy Tolton and Scott Boyer from Jacksonville and from here in Orlando, you know, they're in We the People, these were all great Southern bands that really, really mattered, and they were, and Tin House, and I mean, these were our friends, you know, so it was the scene here in Florida, we were making them and they were making us, you know, it was just like everything else that we did at that radio station. It was community. You know, I've always believed it was like, how do you win? You win by becoming synonymous with your community. You make everybody better, and everybody makes you better, and it becomes, you know, this really important thing. And so you know that, and we did the same thing with our bands. You know,
Do you remember when we had Nighthawk at the bar on Edgewater Drive, and Greg Allen showed up for piano and Muddy Waters who was on bass?
Oh, right. I mean, we just crazy stuff happened. You know, just crazy stuff. Well, I think.
Edgewater Park.
Oh, Edgewater Park was happening.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, and there was Alan Weissman and the Back Door. You know, behind the Beefy King on Fairbanks, where we did Brian Auger and Eric Quincy Tate band.
I spent so much time at the Back Door that I had my mail delivered there. I mean, it was just, I remember seeing Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers when they were called Mudcrutch play there for a week. I mean, there were so many Outlaws were almost like a house band there. One night, Skinnerd and Charlie Daniels were playing out at the Orlando Sports Stadium, and the Outlaws were booked that week at the Back Door, and after the concert, I had introduced Skinnerd, and then I was at Back Door afterwards, and we got a call. Skinnerd wanted to come over and play, and they were wondering if they could borrow the Outlaws' equipment. I mean, there were so many amazing shows that we had. Kathy McDonald play there. Mose Jones, another great band that we love. It's a great time.
And Mike Lyons, who is sitting down here at the end of the table with us tonight, Michael was very instrumental in getting the Outlaws signed, you know, because he was a music director, and he was a wonderful music director, and he was heavily involved on every level. And Charlie was like, why can't I get this band signed? You know, I mean, they were from Tampa, you know, basically, but why can't I get this band signed? And Michael was really instrumental in getting the guys from Arista down to see the band play. And when they saw them play, they were like, let's sign this band. They were the first rock band signed to Arista Records. Arista Records at the time was owned by Clive Davis, you know, who had come from Columbia, where he had made Janis Joplin and Billy Joel and Everybody Giant and Blood, Sweat and Tears and the Electric Flag, and I mean, he had great ears, and he got it, and the Outlaws got signed to Arista Record, and Michael played a pivotal role in getting them down to see the band. We were making things happen. We were making Florida a center for rock and roll, you know, to the outside world. It already was. The rest of the world just didn't know it yet. You know, we helped make it happen that way.
I wanted to touch on one thing that I think a lot of people didn't realize in the beginning is we did not actually consider ourselves progressive rock. We considered ourselves progressive music. But after a while, we just sort of went along with it because everybody kept calling us progressive rock. So we said, oh, what the heck? I mean, after all, a lot of what we play is rock. Which was one of the reasons why, getting back on one thing that Neal brought up, is my objection to ZZ Top's song at that point. And it was only that song, and it was based on the fact that my roots were country originally. And I understood the difference between progressive country and Grand Ole Opry. God help me. You could get the same comment probably from Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings as you would get from me on something like this. But I had heard bands in country music that sounded very similar, which was my reason for objecting. I didn't hate them, didn't dislike them. Actually, at that time, really the only song I was familiar with was LaGrange. And I was thinking, I'm not so sure that this is for it. And based on that, Mike and I were toe-to-toe, as we were wont to do in situation. But he believed passionately, and he was right, ultimately, on that particular point. I'll give him that. And, I believed in what I believed and stood up for it. So that's what we did, because we were progressive music, and we played those things. Hell, we played Waylon and Willie, and we played a lot of different things, as we pointed out. There was jazz in what went on. Doug and I used to have a great laugh about Eric Carmen, one of his songs. It was a definite Rachmaninoff ripoff. And we'd sit in the control room, and that song would be running, and we'd both go da-da-da-da right at the end of it, which was the signature that Rachmaninoff used on all of his music. And so anyway, it's just we wanted to clear that up. I wanted to make everybody know I'm not guilty of everything.
I have a comment regarding Eric Carmen and his plagiarism of Rachmaninoff. It wasn't so much that he used Rachmaninoff's melodies in his songs and added his lyrics to them. It was a nice homage to Rachmaninoff. Rachmaninoff's music had been used, as was Tchaikovsky's, as the basis for popular songs for some time. The sticking point for me was the fact that the album said, all songs written by Eric Carmen. No credit to Sergei Rachmaninoff. Thank you very much.
I want to make the comment, Lee. We were talking about how we had a certain freedom with what we were playing, and there was, you probably won't remember this, Lee, but there was a situation where there was an artist, and when he came out, there was so much hype that came out of New York for this artist. I was just turned off by the hype, and I said, God, I hate that. And so when the record would come up, and when the record would come up in rotation, I would just put it to the back as though I had played it. And eventually Lee figured this out. Yes, I did. And Lee figured it out, and he goes, "You're not playing him." And I said, I don't, it's just a big promo guy. He goes, "Well, he's in concert tonight, and there's a ticket for you to go see him. I think you don't understand, you don't get it." And so I went to the concert, and he was right, and I was completely blown away, and I don't know why I ever objected ever to a guy named Bruce Springsteen. And
You guys gave the very U.S. Bonds record.
That was me. Again, gotta give kudos to Mike Lyons. Mike would let me go into this back room next to the music director's office, and he would have piles. I mean, there were so many albums that came out every week, and there would be just piles and piles of albums that he hadn't gotten to yet. And I mean, we played almost everything, but there would still be a bunch of albums that never made it on the air. And I would pick through them. I mean, I did mornings. I was home every day by noon. And I would take a stack of records home from the loser stack and just, check it all out. And I was a very, very devoted Bob Dylan fan. And
He was the new Dylan.
But that was given to him. At this point, nobody knew who the hell this guy was. And I took a bunch of records home, and the first time that I put the needle down on Greetings from Asbury Park, New Jersey, it was like I'd seen God. I've now seen Bruce 65 times and counting. I've had dinner with him. I've seen so many Springsteen shows. And I used to play Bruce at least once or twice a day on my show. Not only at ORJ, but everywhere I worked for years later. And years later, when he finally, I think with The River or Born to Run, when he finally, people started hearing about who this guy was, it was, so that's that guy that we used to hear on the radio. And the first time I saw Bruce, he played the Tampa High Life Fronton. Lee had already fired me, and I was now working in Sarasota. I still love his name.
I got his ticket.
And so I was going to get to introduce Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band on stage at the Tampa High Life Fronton, and I couldn't believe it. On the way there, I was going to meet God that night, and I wanted to make an impression. And I knew from tapes that I'd gotten from people up north, because Bruce had never played Florida before, I knew that he did a lot of oldie covers in his show, and I knew that he often did Quarter to Three by Gary U.S. Bonds. The first album I ever bought as a kid was Dance Till Quarter to Three by Gary U.S. Bonds. So I brought the record with me, and when I met Bruce before the show, I was introduced to him, I gave him the record, and he flipped out. He said, "Oh my God, this is a collector's item," you know. And then he saw on the top of the record, you know, my name was written there, because when you're a kid, you put your name on everything, so, you know, so my brother wouldn't steal it. And I know he's watching, sorry. And so he said, "This you?" I said, "Yeah." And it was weird. He never really said thank you, but he took the record. And then 3.5 hours, I got to introduce the band on stage. And 3.5 hours later, he comes out for his third encore. And he says, "This goes out for my man Neal." And played Quarter to Three. And it was just one of the highlights. But I still owe Mike Lyons for, you know, for letting me pick through that stack and find this gem that to this day is still my favorite artist.
Real quick, you know, our staff meetings were encounter sessions. They were legendary. We had them every week, and we killed each other. We loved each other. We did everything. We were family. You know, like it's like sitting around the dinner table, you know, with family that you really love, and you can get mad at each other, but you get it all out. And we did that, you know, and we were an amazing group of people together. We were better together than we would have ever been separately. And we hung together, okay? We hung together. You know, I've worked at radio stations all over the country since then, and the only one that's special to me on a level that's like my heart and soul is WORJ. And I programmed in Detroit and Milwaukee and blah, 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 blah. You know, but and I want to pass this one to Doug because it's a great story. Doug, I want you to, at one of those staff meetings, something really funny happened. And so this one is for Doug to tell, because it's just a great story.
We had a member of the air staff who had started out as one of our part-timers, fresh out of, I guess it was still FTU at the time. And Lee, as he is wont to do, recognized potential in this young man and put him on the air as one of our weekenders. He eventually became full-time. And he had an odd sense of humor, largely because a lot of the things that he thought were funny wore out very quickly on the rest of us. And he had a tendency to be a little bit of a suck-up. And so he started referring to Lee as LJ, Lee Joseph Arnold. And so it was LJ this, LJ that. "Hey LJ, how you doing?" You know, this was getting to be really tiresome. Let's sing on. What did I do here? Sorry. Up. Must not be Duracell. Was that a free plug? Sorry, didn't mean that. So, you know, I, for one, had it up to here with this LJ routine. And this particular individual at a staff meeting in Lee's office referred to Lee as LJ. And I lost it. And I lit into him and said, "You know, your problem is that you just don't realize when the joke is worn out, you just keep pushing it. You know, you're the only one who still thinks this is funny, blah, 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 blah." I mean, I read him up one side and down the other.
For about 10 minutes.
It wasn't 10 minutes. It seemed like 10 minutes. It was 9.5 minutes, actually. No, But-
Felt like an hour.
But I obviously made the point because when I finished this tirade, a pall had fallen over the room and everybody just sat there kind of looking at their shoes thinking, God, man, I don't know what to say. I mean, Doug just really unloaded on this poor guy. And at that point, I felt a little bit guilty because I'd really seriously rocked the boat here, you know. And while everybody was sitting there shuffling their feet, trying to figure out how to break the ice in the room and get the conversation going again, Lee included, who's, you know, conducting the meeting, all of a sudden this spark of an idea hit me out of nowhere. And I turned to Lee and I said, "Right, LJ?" And everybody had the reaction you just did. Everybody in the room just came apart. And I had made my point. And I think at that point he stopped calling you LJ,
Yeah, I don't
actually.
think he ever called me LJ again.
So don't make me angry. Adam?
I'll ask one quick question for everybody on the panel, and then I'll open it up. I know that there are a lot of people here who have history with some of these people, and whether as a listener, whether as a coworker, or as a friend. And I know that there are other stories to be told, questions to be asked. But for a young person like myself, you've talked so much about this being the not only the best music in a generation, but really, and maybe this is fitting here, but the music that's coming out in this era is really sort of a museum piece for American music generally, right? I remember reading the first time I bought a copy of Kind of Blue, the liner notes were an essay written by Greg Allman, I believe, and he used the phrase, when the aliens come down from outer space to zap us with their freeze rays, and they want to know one reason why we shouldn't obliterate the human race, I'm going to play them Kind of Blue. And so really just quickly going down the line, I wondered, with all of the music, I mean, Neal, you mentioned stacks and stacks and stacks of records, just sort of thinking quickly, whether it's an album or a song, what's your favorite? As somebody who spends as much time with music as you do, and I know that that's not a question and that's why I'm trying to limit it from this era.
Oh, from this era?
Yeah, from no,
From this,
since 8. No.
from that time or from this time?
From that time, when you guys were on the air, trying to limit. I know favorite record is a silly question to ask, but to somebody who either wasn't around or something like that, where would you start? Maybe it's Gary U.S. Bonds. When it's one of these others, something you were listening to, whether growing up or while you were on the air.
Well, I've had some education in classical training, but or appreciation. Doug is the classical musician, actually very great. And so orchestrative classical structure within music is something that fascinates me. And so to this day, I still think the greatest things, some of the greatest things I've ever heard was Pink Floyd.
Well, you really can't narrow this down too well. A favorite.
The mic on this guy.
Oh, boy. I remember, although it's not my all-time favorite album, I remember when Fleetwood Mac Rumors was released. And the album came in the mail, and I was in the office doing my production shift. Everybody had, in addition to the shift when they were on the radio, they had a shift where they recorded commercials and took care of other duties. Steve made sure that our public service announcements were all up to date and that sort of thing. Everybody had another job besides just being a disc jockey. And here was this brand new Fleetwood Mac album, and I took it into the production studio and I dropped it on the turntable. And I listened to the first cut and I went, wow. And then I picked the stylus up and I dropped it on the second cut and I went, unbelievable. And I picked it up and I put it on the third cut and I went, wow, that's a single right there. Then I dropped it on the next cut and it was mind-blowing. And I went, this is going to be one of the greatest rock albums of all time. There are very few albums that I have come across in my life of any genre where there is not one bad cut. And that album just absolutely knocked my socks off. Although, now that I think about it, I think my reputation at the radio station was for playing Sugarloaf. I loved Green Eyed Lady by Sugarloaf.
The long version.
The long version, yeah, all 8 minutes of it.
You went to the bathroom.
Ba 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 ba. Bow, bow. I mean, I probably played it more than I should have, but it deserved it. Sorry, nobody else could see that. So thank you, whoever agrees with me out there. Next.
Impossible to pick one. I mean, on any given day, it could be the Beatles' Rubber Soul, it could be Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, it could be the first Springsteen album, it could be Steely Dan's Pretzel Logic or Countdown to Ecstasy. I mean, that was the beauty of what we were doing then, is that what you have today and what you've had for the last 25, 30 years, actually what we had back then, it was called broadcasting. What you have now is narrowcasting. Now every station is targeted to a very specific demographic, and the music is very heavily researched, and the music is all computer-generated playlists that the disc jockeys play off of, if there is even a live human being in the studio. We did broadcasting, now it's narrowcasting. It was not unusual in a half hour's time for any one of us in a half hour to go from Led Zeppelin to maybe a track off of Stevie Wonder's Inner Visions, to maybe an old Mamas and the Papas or Guess Who or Grassroots, to Cheech and Chong, to Waylon Jennings, to Chick Corea, Return to Forever, to Pink Floyd. I mean, it just went. It ran. Oh, Monty Python. My very first day going on the air at ORJ, I was on my way down West Colonial, way out to the studio, listening to Mike Lyons doing the overnight show, and he played the Argument Clinic off of the Monty Python album. And I almost drove off the road. It was the funniest thing. And I know I liked Firesign Theater, but I loved Monty Python, and I owe that to Mike. And it's funny because I see people out here that I shared a house with back then, and that's all we did. I mean, we memorized those Monty Python albums. But the thing is, there was all of this freedom that we had to go, you know, there were no restrictions, and you could go from the Rolling Stones to Joni Mitchell, to Santana, to Black Sabbath, you know, all in a 15-minute span. And that's what made the kind of radio that we did so special.
To Gato Barbieri, to, the funniest cut we played on the radio was a thing called Pigeon Park. Okay, everyone, we all loved playing Pigeon Park. It was by a comedy troupe called the Congress of Wonders. Okay, and the concept was that it was Jerry Garcia and was it Phil? And Phil, okay, you know, and they were now 65 years old in the park, and pot was legal, and the cocaine helicopters coming from the police, you know, dropping it on them. And, you know, uptight old freaks, the cops yelling at the, you know, it was a very funny bit. But we loved playing different, why not make you laugh in the midst of all of this? I got in late last night. My nephew, Stephen, picked me up, and because of that, I didn't get to sleep until 5 because we ended up talking about music and stuff, and because he's a really fine budding musician, and one of the things we talked about was back in the day, when we would play an artist, we really cared who that artist's inspirations were, right? And that itself would help launch somebody who had been passed over, right? I mean, we most probably would have really not been that hip to B.B. King if it hadn't been for Eric Clapton telling us, oh yeah, B.B. King.
Speak for yourself.
Excuse me. That's because you were listening to WLAC in Nashville and with your transistor radio under your pillow. But and the other, my favorite band, other than of course the Beatles, because that goes without saying, right? It's like, other than the Beatles, who's your favorite band? Because they changed the world, okay? And they changed everything about music. And Sgt. Pepper opened up the door for this format, okay? So I mean, there's the Beatles, and then everybody else. And then the everybody else, my favorite band was Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Okay, because, and the harmonies that Crosby, Stills, and Nash did were unlike anything that had been done before in rock music. It was totally different. It changed the way that whole sound happened. And there's a great interview, and Stephen and I listened to YouTube videos last night. There was a great interview with Graham Nash, and it was like, where did you guys get that inspiration for the way you did your harmonies? And he was like, oh, there's this unbelievable album from 1954 by the Bulgarian Women's Choir. Okay, and I swear to God, if you listen to this music from 1954 from the Bulgarian Women's Choir, you hear, and there's like, what was it, like 25 or 30 of these women from 1954. And the harmonies, you've never heard harmonies like this before. And these guys were searching that kind of stuff out so that they could find how to do things special and different and make things, happen and so, so we're doing that at 5 this morning. Excuse me, I know I'll fall asleep in any minute now. But Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Stephen Stills was brilliant. I loved him from the Buffalo Springfield days. I loved David Crosby from the days of the Byrds. I loved Graham Nash from the Hollies. I loved Neil Young when he joined the band because, of course, he and Stephen had that unbelievable relationship in the Buffalo Springfield. And talk about an album that, when I put the needle down on it for the very first time, the first CSN album, pick a song that's not great on that album. And I started my show every night on WORJ with Long Time Gone, and I ended my show every night with 49 Bye-Byes from that album. So, it became my signature. If I was running late driving out to the FM, Doug would hit Long Time Gone for me, and I'd come running out of the car and get in there before the song ended. But he knew what song to play for me to start my show. So yeah, I love lots of bands, but they're the ones that have a very special place in my heart. Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Steve?
I guess we can maybe rule out ZZ Top. No, they're an excellent group. I actually cut my teeth listening to Radio Moscow.
So you listen to the Bulgarian Women's Choir.
Yeah, beautiful work. To me, I like listening to all different kinds of music. I'm not a big rap fan, but then you listen to some things like Arlo Guthrie. What is he but rap?
Dylan?
Dylan
was doing rap.
In country music, there was John Hartford, and people like that. But there are single individual things that stand out to me. Long Time Gone being a good example of that. It struck me as neat because it was one of those songs that if you wanted to grab someone's attention, that was a song you could do it with. It was a radio man's tool in a way, because one thing I noticed early on, that anytime you had a room full of radio announcers and other people, if that song came on, you watched everything get quiet suddenly, because it just started by dominating the room like no other song does. And then people get back to talking or listening or whatever they were doing, but it would have an effect every time. It was sort of like when you're in a room and the record's playing, and then it crosses from one song to the next, and all the radio announcers go, like, oh my God, I just missed my cue. So that was a pain. But I have to say that just about any different kind of music, really, I like progressive music. And it doesn't matter to me where it's from or what style of music it is. I can kind of get into a lot of different things, but I can't really pick a hit. I like Pink Floyd, of course. I think a lot of people do. I've heard. But I love classical music. And in fact, I've had some enjoyable times with Doug. We went to the symphony together on at least one occasion, and that was an incredibly enjoyable night. I was there with someone who could explain things to me, and it was a great experience, and I'll never forget it. But to me, I can't turn it off, because I did a thing once with Wolfman Jack. Oh, God. Okay, he was well known in his time and everything else, but I listened to him make a comment that they don't write music like this anymore. They don't write good music anymore. And I just looked at him and I said, "Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Of course they write good music. It may not be your music, it may not be my music, but there's a lot of good music being written. A lot of them are one-hit wonders, if that. But there's a lot of good music out there. You just got to listen for it. I love listening to bluegrass, because it is very progressive music. So I can't pick one, sorry.
Justin Bieber.
Justin Bieber. You got to leave my hero out of this. That kid could have had a great career, which I think he's trashed tremendously by being a horse's patoot.
Did you say patoot, sir?
I said patoot, man.
Watch it.
Cut that.
But no, it's just one of those things, I guess. He's got his life to live. Anyway, Hanna.
Oh, man.
She couldn't possibly have a musical choice.
No way. No. I refuse to answer this. 7 years old, I spent 33 cents on my first single. It was the Everly Brothers, Kathy's Clown. It got played over and over and over and over. And as my allowance upped, I've started collecting singles, just one after the other, after the other, after the other. And I would buy anything in the bargain bin, 3 for $1. And it wouldn't matter what it was. I'd just bring it home. I had probably 20,000 singles by the time I left home. So to me, music is something that's, again, these gentlemen are broadcasters. They love music, but music is everything to me. Everything to me, which is why I own a record store. Which is why when Steve said they don't make music like this anymore, you're right, they don't make music like this anymore. Hopefully, they won't. There's still magnificence out there. There's still beauty and splendor and intelligence and humor and perfection being made out there today. It's not a dead thing. It's alive and it's well and it's out there at your record store.
On vinyl.
Not necessarily on vinyl, but yeah, it helps. That's why I like the streaming services. They help turn people onto this. But for me, the flashpoint of all music, all progressive rock, is the Beatles' White Album. Only the Beatles' White Album, not Abbey Road, not anything else. That was such a disjointed, disorganized project. They hardly ever recorded together. They were completely on separate planes all the time. It is the flashpoint of rap. It is the flashpoint of country rock. It is the flashpoint of punk. It is the flashpoint of everything that was to be. So that 1968 record kind of encapsulates everything that happened afterward and is still happening today. So I guess in a certain point, that's the greatest album for me ever made because it's everything. But it's all everything. And that's...
Is it on sale this week?
No, it's not. But the point is, it's still out there. It's still being made. They're still doing it. The musicians are still out there. The brilliance is still out there. We just don't celebrate it the way we were lucky enough to celebrate it. It's being shuffled away. It's being Palladia'd. It's being Spotified. There's no visceral, physical connection to the music like you had with records, like you had with personalities, like you had with people saying, man, I can't wait to play this for you. You know, that's gone. Maybe we can bring it back in some way, who knows? But the music is still there, and it's always there. The end.
I have to say I agree. When I was in elementary school, I took in Piggies off of the White Album. I think I was in first grade and my show and tell was playing Piggies. At this time, I'd like to open up the floor to ask people if you have any questions from the audience, questions or answers. I'll come down and go Maury Povich with you guys. But if anybody has any questions or things they'd like to add or share, I'll come around with the microphone. We've got time for a few.
I have to reveal that Lee is my brother-in-law, first off. I love him.
And my attorney.
And I want to know if this is true. I've told you the story. When I was a young teenager, I was home from being away at school, and it was like, 11 o'clock, and this guy with this great voice comes on, and he says, we're going to do something different. I think this may have been the first time I actually heard your station. We're going to play one side, and I think it was like Houses of the Holy or something. Yeah. It was the first album format that I know of that anybody had done. Was that the first time it was ever done in the country that you know of?
No.
No?
Does this work? Oh, it does work. Most probably not, but we were one of the first. We were undoubtedly the first in the state, and we were one of the first to do it anywhere. It was just something that we thought, for us, it was Christmas every day at the radio station. When we'd get sometimes 40 packages, sometimes 10 packages of albums would come in the mail from record companies who wanted us to play their records. And Mike, my music director, and I would open up these packages. It was Christmas. Okay, every day was Christmas at the radio station, and then we would pick what's going to be the feature album tonight. What are we going to turn people onto? And it wasn't necessarily, because it's the new Steely Dan album, okay, though that would certainly move to the top of the pile, but it might be, we discovered something that was totally not, that we were really turning people on to.
Wasn't the best?
Yeah, it was like,
That's the best feeling in the world.
I didn't get into radio because I wanted to be the program director. I became the program director so that I wouldn't have to work for a-holes, okay? And so it was like, my attitude was if I'm going to work for an ass, it's going to be me, okay? And but I got into the radio because I wanted to turn people onto music. I love music, and I'm not a musician. Okay, so how do I do it? I got into radio, and so the feature album to us was here. Let me turn you on to, because in those days too, unlike today where it's very track oriented, one song. In those days, you bought albums, and you lived with that album. Maybe you only listened to side one over and over and over again. And then at some point you discovered side 2, after you bought the record. It was like, oh my God, there's great songs on this other side too. But I mean, you knew every song on the album, and so it was really important to us to turn people on to music.
I think part of that was we had a huge record player, and we wanted to invite everybody over to listen.
Yeah.
Simple as that. And great stuff.
Yeah.
And it was so much fun. And it was so much fun doing that.
Anyone else?
But maybe.
Okay, I'm going to make a comment first, and then I'm going to ask a question. And I remember when there's some sort of mechanical breakdown or something out in the Orange Grove or whatever, that all of a sudden you had to kind of improvise and come up with something to play. You had collection albums, downtown or whatever, and what you'd fill until the mechanical thing was solved was play album halves all afternoon or all evening, whatever it took, until you could get back into your regular format. And I used to love that.
And it happened often because that horrible little building broke down all the time. All the time.
Right.
In the middle of nowhere, our bunker, that's what I called it. Our bunker is this like 450 square foot concrete building with a 5 billion foot tower on top of it, just waiting to get hit by lightning.
Yeah.
In the lightning belt of...
I'm out there alone, 2 a.m. till 6 a.m. in this horrible orange grove, just waiting to die. That was my first month on the air. I thought, well, this is it. Tonight I die. You'd open up the door to get out, and pygmy rattlesnakes embedded themselves. I mean, we were in the middle of nowhere. So it was really nice to move to Pine Hills.
But I must also say about that horrible little room out in the middle of the orange grove was, we were in a little room out in the middle of an orange grove. Okay? Salespeople weren't coming in and saying, let me pull that copy and take this away from you, or blah, 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 blah. And, and things, and if we wanted to do things that we know we shouldn't admit, we could do that. Okay, statute of limitations has expired, and and you were there in your own world. It was like the Beach Boys song "In My Room," right? You were in your room doing. So I mean, it had its.
And chain smoke.
And you could chain smoke, and you could do whatever you want, and you could just go to some new place there. So I mean, it sucked. And it was the best thing in the world, all at the same time. So yeah, I loved that little room, and I hated it like crazy.
I should point out, though, that very often when you heard us play these long album sides and stuff, it wasn't always because of technical difficulties. We used back in the early 70s, there was an FCC requirement that, every 2 hours or something, you had to go outside to check the tower lights, to make sure that the lights on the tower were all blinking. And if a light was out, you had to call, there was a number on the board for the local FAA to let them know, so no small planes would fly into the tower. So we used to say, I'm going outside to check the tower lights. And you get the picture. It wasn't always technical difficulties.
Okay. Okay, and my question for you.
Well, I do have to add this real quickly because I remember when I had the station had first started, and we were at number 1 North Orange Avenue, and I was doing some paperwork at the front desk where Shirley Christmas was our receptionist, and she was sitting next to me looking at some paperwork, and Doug was on the air. And there was a storm, and he was talking about something, all of a sudden, and it was dead quiet. I went, oh my God, we're off the air. And then all of a sudden it comes back on and Doug says, well, I don't know what happened there. I guess it was a storm, and I'm not sure exactly what I was saying to you at the time, but let me tell you that, and it went off again, and I went, wow, 2 lightning hits in a row. And what was happening with Doug was that he would, lightning goes, and he would turn the microphone off and turn the volume of it down and go into the other room and check the transmitter and then fire it back up and then come back around and turn the microphone on and start talking. And then it happened again. So he shut the microphone off and he went around the corner and he comes back and he turns it back on again. This kept happening. Finally, and it happened again. And this time, Doug walks into the other room, he checks the transmitter, turns it back on, having not turned the microphone off when he left the room the 3rd time. Do you remember what you said?
Yes.
What was it?
Was the one and only time during my broadcasting career that I delivered the F-bomb on the air.
Taking him from perfect to nearly.
Let me clarify. Our transmitter, once it was shut down by a power surge or a lightning strike, when we walked out of the studio and over to the control panel on the transmitter, when you hit the button to turn the carrier back on that enables you to broadcast, the transmitter would go through about a 90-second recycle routine before the carrier came back up. You could hit the button, but you weren't back on the air yet. There was no carrier. And so I went back to the mixing board, and as was required by the FCC at the time, I said, this is WORJ FM Mount Dora, Orlando, returning to the air after a power failure. And no sooner had I gotten the words out of my mouth that we went off again. I went out, repeated the process, waiting for the carrier to come up, looked through the window, saw that, okay, we had a carrier again. Did the sign on, and in the middle of saying it, boop, off the air. So for whatever reason, God does have a sense of humor. I left the microphone on as I went over there to recycle the transmitter, and don't ask me why, but this time it didn't wait for the time delay. The carrier came back on right away. And as I walked back in the studio and slammed the door, I said, this is effing ridiculous.
To the world.
Yes, to the world. And a short time later, after I'd gotten back into music, the hotline rang. And of course it was Lee saying, by any chance, did somebody out there possibly say something about something being effing ridiculous? I felt like this tall. In 20 or something years of broadcasting, it's the only time I ever said a bad word on the air.
But, I think the interesting thing was that at that time, in those days, we had spent so many years as broadcasters under the hammer of the FCC, knowing that it said if you did this intentionally, you could go to prison and be fined $10,000. So it was not a light thing. But I remember with amazement how the entire office stopped, froze, and just stared at the speaker, thinking they could somehow change what had happened.
My bad.
Because of who our audience was, we never had a complaint about it. Okay, I mean that's really important. And real quick, and one day, Jack, who was the greatest general manager a human being could hope to work for, and Jack and I were pals, and that really helped. But one day, Jack freaked out. And I walked into the radio station, and he had pulled the Billy Joel albums out, had them bring it in because it had the word masturbate on it. And he said to me, we can't play a song that says masturbate. And I said, the Jefferson Airplane were on Dick Cavett last night, and they sang this song called We Could Be Together, and in it there's a line that says, up against the wall, mother effer. And I said, that's the line we can't cross, Jack. And he was like, yeah, okay. and handed it back to me. And the key was, never did we ever have a complaint from our audience because of the content that we played. Not one time, never, ever did it ever happen. Nor did we ever have a complaint about Doug losing his A+ and being dropped down to an A for using that word. Okay.
Okay, now here's the one question I have for you. Who came up with the concept for April Fools?
We all did. I mean, it was one of those things where we tossed it around. We thought, wouldn't this be cool? Let's do this thing. Because again, our encounter session meetings, and when Doug would get off the air and I would come on the air, he'd stay out there with me until the end of my show sometimes. Okay, because we were buds. And then we'd go back to my house, and my then wife would make us dinner, and we would jam, but we all did that together. I mean, we were jamming constantly. How can we do things that are crazy, that really blow people's minds, that are really fun? And we kind of all together came up with this concept of let's do something on April Fool's Day that will blow people's minds. And we worked for months in advance, recording 40 or 50 or 60 fake commercials. And in some case, and I went to Jack and said, we got to clear all the commercials off on April 1st. And he was like, okay. What general manager would ever do that? And I went to the sales force and I said, if you can get some of your clients to buy fake commercials about them, we'll sell them to them. And Jackie went out and sold actual fake advertisements to advertisers to be part of the fun, right? And everybody wrote their own commercials. So every commercial on the air was a joke, okay? And every back announcement of the records was fake. The songs were, the musical format of the radio station didn't change. I mean, every song was the right songs that should be played, but what we told you that we just played was crazy stuff, okay? And it was just so much fun, and our audience just played along with us and really enjoyed it. I mean, but everybody put in all of that work just on their own because it was like, isn't this going to be fun? Oh, this is going to be crazy, And it was big time fun.
The one I remember is Steve Mack's Colonel Flanders' War-Torn Chicken.
I think I had my own 10-inch reel in there. I was just, like everybody here, we were so immersed in what we were doing all the time that our minds were just constantly going, whether we were on the air or off the air. So you had to burn it off some way. And my way was doing the weird commercials. I had the Hindenburg Travel Agency, a couple of those things. Johnny Sutton, when he was with us, would sit in that production room and laugh his tail off. And he would pick up the nuances of stuff that was buried in these things. But whether it was that or whether it was those crazy PSA cards we had, that the only rule we had is you couldn't write in the actual copy, but the stuff that was written around the copy, on the back of it was nuts. And it was just the creative minds of these guys cutting loose. And you look forward to it every day. You go in the control room and you pick up the cards and read them. Or you'd say, well, what else is going on in here today? Because there was always something. You couldn't leave anything alone. Something from the newspaper. Somebody recaption it and stick it on the wall.
You know what I had?
Crazy.
The production logs.
Production logs.
We kept logs.
Oh, you're talking pass down logs.
Pass down logs.
I own them. I have them.
Oh my gosh.
I'm giving them to the museum.
We would leave instructions for the next shift. And it was insanity. You would literally, you'd go back 15 pages to read just so you could laugh your ass off. I mean, it was just so much fun and so funny and so ridiculous. And
Throw a quarter.
I miss us. Okay.
All right, I think we've got time for a couple more questions, and then we'll reopen the exhibit for everybody, and these guys will get on with recording some of their documentary questions and answers. But I know there were a couple people back here.
Well, I actually have a confession to make, and a message. So the confession would be that when I was probably 15, the second guy there, no, the other second guy. I had a crush on Steve Mack. I thought I was going to marry you, Steve, but I married my drummer, so it worked out in the end. But every day we would come home from school and turn on the radio, and you were my life. Every day after school, we'd take our little transistor radio to the beach and listen to you every day. That's what we did. And I know the young people in this room, or younger people in this room, might go into a coma, but we didn't have, YouTube, Spotify, Pandora, MTV, maybe one performance a week on Ed Sullivan. Where did we get our music? How did we know what was cool or what was available? From you guys. So the message would be that, for thousands and thousands of people got to listen to what was great because of you. My obvious connection to your panel would be that this guy on the end is my brother, but I saw a picture that I think Lee Arnold put on Facebook this week. I didn't realize till then that my brother used to look like he was maybe one of the Beau Brummels or something, but back then. But so he used to bring home albums that would inform my musical taste and world. But it came from people like you who had the passion to put it out there on the airwaves. That's where we got it from. And most, everyone got to listen to it and enjoy it, but there were probably, I don't know, maybe thousands of people in the Central Florida area who became professional musicians from that era. And I'll make myself the self-appointed spokesman for them tonight and say that, it's because of what you put out there that we didn't just hear it, we probably ingested it. And Ron's my keyboard guy, and he can attest to this. It's like if you take a blood sample, that's what you're going to get right now would be the music that you play, because we ingested it, it's infused it into ourself. And I'm like you, Hanna. It's why we wake up and breathe in and breathe out every day, is the music. And I want to thank you all. I mean, you might take credit for thousands of musicians having a professional career because of you, but you also might take the blame for it, so I'm just saying.
We thank you for... You scared the hell out of me at the beginning when you said you had a confession. My biggest fear about coming to this thing was some stranger in the early 40s coming up to me and saying, "Hi, Dad."
And not an unlikely thing, because Neal dated at least 1,000 women in the time that he was at this radio station. He was quite amazing.
And on that note, I think we have time for about one more, and then we'll wrap up.
Hi, Dad.
You're on my next radio show.
I do have a question. For generations who have never really experienced this type of radio, do you or would you consider streaming online or making it available in any other way, like any of your archived broadcasts?
For the last 8 years, at great personal expense, not really that much, but enough, I've been streaming a station called WORJ.com on the air, which is made up of about 10,000 songs. Okay, so it is kind of the library. It doesn't have disc jockeys per se. It has mostly me, just saying listener supported WORJ.com. But so that does exist, WORJ.com, and the actual host for it is Live 365, which is another way that you can get to it. And so that exists, and then of course you can listen to it on a smartphone as well. I also designed a radio station recently, because I consult stations. I designed a radio station in Minnesota called The Goat, and which is WXYG, and they're an over-the-air AM radio station, which is now going to also be an FM radio station this week, and they're also and they also stream, and it's a time warp. It's 1979, and you're listening to your favorite progressive rock radio station. What would you hear? That's this radio station. You know, classic rock radio stations play 200 to 400 songs, same ones over and over again. First week you listen to them, you think, oh great, what a great radio station. Second week you go, oh, they're playing all the same songs they played last week. This station, The Goat, is 5,000 to 7,000 songs instead of 200 songs, and it's 5 cuts deep, not 1 cut deep. And it's doing extremely well as an over-the-air radio station, highly appealing, obviously, to people who grew up on stations like WORJ, who are so dissatisfied with this crap they call classic rock. So yes, yeah, and you can also stream that one as well. And bottom line, and this is my determination, I swear to God this will happen. I will buy a radio station in Orlando, and I have no idea how I'm going to do this, but I'm going to put ORJ back on here.
I can't possibly think of a better note to end on. I think that the sentiment was really well said. Steve, I think, actually nailed it. That whether this radio is coming out in the 70s, whether it's being streamed today on your computer, whether it's some kid who has a recording machine in his basement, good music is being made and good radio is still out there, and the connections that kind of sustain communities like this are still alive and still vital. This community is still here. This is Orlando. This was Orlando. This continues to be Orlando. This is a really phenomenal moment in Orlando history, in Central Florida history, and this brings to a close WORJ, a town hall for the counterculture. I cannot thank these ladies and gentlemen enough, and I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. The second half of their night is just beginning. They're going to be doing some interviews for this great documentary that's going to be coming out. Be sure to keep your eyes out for Freeform Baby. At this time, we'll open up the galleries again. You guys are welcome to mill about. If you happen to have a story to tell, whether in oral history or some items hanging out in your attic or your basement, please, my name is Adam Ware, and I would love to talk to you. You will officially become my favorite person in the room. But I hope you guys enjoy your night, and again, thank you for coming out to the Orange County Regional History Center.
Thank you, Adam.
Six.